I watched my own wife being escorted out of our son's wedding by two security guards. Betty walked slowly. She was still smiling, as if this were nothing more than a small misunderstanding. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law stood near the stage, covering her mouth like she was crying. But her eyes, they were strangely calm, almost cold. Maybe she just got confused, Victoria told the guests. The ring worth $2 million. We found it in Mom's purse. They believed my wife had taken it, but I was the only one who knew something else. That ring wasn't there when the morning began. Before I tell you the rest of this story, there's something I've always been curious about. Where are you listening to me from? Leave a comment with the name of your city or your country. I truly enjoy reading them every evening, and if you'd like to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now, let's go back to that morning. Back to the moment when everything still looked perfectly normal. I stood there for a few seconds, watching Betty being led outside. No one asked for my opinion. No one thought I had anything to say. In their eyes, the story was already clear. A blue diamond ring worth $2 million had disappeared, and it had been found inside the purse of a 70-year-old woman, a woman who lately had been showing signs of memory loss. A perfect script. Except, I knew it had been written in advance. That morning had begun quietly. The glass mansion sat peacefully on the cliff above Lake Tahoe. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, filling the house with light, like a crystal box. Event staff moved gently through the halls, carrying white flowers and trays of champagne glasses. I stood on the balcony for a long while. At 72, I no longer enjoy loud celebrations, but it was my son's wedding, and I felt I should at least be there. Betty was in the family dressing room. She always liked fixing little things for the children on important days. I knew she had spent the entire morning folding table linens again and adjusting the small flower arrangements. That was Betty's way. For 40 years, she had stayed quietly in the background, keeping everything in this family in order. Maybe that was exactly why Victoria chose her as the target. I hadn't meant to overhear anything. I was simply walking past the hallway behind the guest dressing room. The door wasn't fully closed, and Victoria's voice slipped out, low but clear. "Tonight everything will be over." I stopped. Inside the room, Victoria stood in front of the vanity table. Her white wedding dress spread across the floor like a sheet of cold snow. Stephen stood near the window, his back turned to her. "Are you sure?" Stephen asked. "Completely sure," Victoria replied. "Everyone already knows your mother has been forgetting things lately." I heard the soft click of a small box opening. "All we need," Victoria continued, "is one moment." I leaned slightly, looking through the small gap in the door. On the vanity table sat a small velvet tray, and on it was Margaret's blue diamond ring. Margaret was one of the most important guests at the ceremony. A wealthy woman, someone who had known our family for years. That ring was famous enough that almost anyone could recognize it. Victoria picked it up. The blue light of the diamond reflected in the mirror in front of her. "All it has to do," she said calmly, "is appear inside her purse. After that, everyone will finish the story themselves." Stephen said nothing for a few seconds. Then he gave a small nod. I don't think there has ever been a moment in my life that felt colder than that one. Not because of the ring, but because of how easily my son accepted the plan, as if it were just another detail in his wedding schedule. Victoria closed the box. "Don't worry," she said. "We don't have to do anything dramatic. We just need people to believe she took it." Stephen asked a question I will never forget, and then what Victoria looked straight into the mirror. Then she said slowly, "Your family will have no reason to question giving us control of the trust." The family trust. I immediately understood what she meant. Betty had been co-managing the Harrison family trust for years. That had been my decision, because I trusted her more than anyone. But if she were seen as someone who was no longer clear-minded, everything would change. Victoria walked toward the chair where Betty had left her purse earlier, a small cream-colored handbag. Victoria herself had given it to Betty a few months before. Back then, she had called it a small gift, to thank Mom. Now, I understood why. Victoria unzipped the purse. No rush, no nervousness. She simply dropped the ring inside, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. A tiny sound echoed as the diamond touched the lining of the bag. Then Victoria closed it again. She turned to Stephen. "It's done. Stephen looked at the purse for a moment. Then he said something I never thought I would hear from my own son. I hope she doesn't notice. Victoria smiled. Did you forget? She said softly. You're the one who said she's been forgetting things. The two of them left the room a few minutes later. I was still standing in the hallway, one hand resting against the cold glass wall. In 40 years inside courtrooms, I've seen many carefully prepared plans, but rarely have I seen one carried out with such calm precision inside my own family. A little while later, Betty returned to the room. She walked in slowly, holding an old family photo frame. The picture had been taken years ago, when Stephen was still a little boy. Betty set the frame down on the table, then picked up her purse. She had no idea what had just happened. She didn't know that inside that purse now was something that didn't belong to her. I watched her for a long moment, and that was when I noticed something Victoria probably hadn't considered. On a table in the reception room, not far away, sat another purse. The same color, the same style, the same brand. Victoria's purse. And in that moment, I realized their plan had a weakness. All it would take was one small change. Very small, but enough to send the whole story in a completely different direction. I stayed in the hallway for a few minutes after Betty left the room. Victoria's words were still echoing in my head. All it has to do is appear in her purse. A simple plan, and a cruel one. I spent most of my life inside courtrooms. I know how traps are built, but I never imagined I would watch one being set for my own wife. I walked back to the reception hall. The music had started. Long tables covered with white linen lined the glass walls. Beyond them, the blue water of Lake Tahoe stretched all the way to the horizon. More guests were arriving. Everyone looked elegant. They spoke softly, raising glasses, offering congratulations. No one knew that just a few minutes earlier, inside this house, a plan had been quietly set in motion. I looked around the room, and it didn't take long to spot the second purse. It sat on a round table near the champagne bar, a cream-colored clutch, same shape, same size. Even the metal clasp looked almost identical to Betty's bag. I didn't need to stare long to know it belonged to Victoria. She stood on the other side of the room, chatting with two friends. A glass of wine in her hand, her head tilted slightly, smiling like today held nothing but happiness. Her purse had been left behind. A small mistake. I didn't rush over. At 72, a man learns how to move slowly, especially when people might be watching. I stopped at the champagne bar and picked up a glass. I nodded to a few old acquaintances. One of them asked if I was proud of my son. I said yes. It sounded like the right answer to them. Then I walked toward the table. Victoria's purse was still there, the clasp slightly open. No one paid any attention to it. I glanced around again. Stephen was speaking with a group of business partners near the stage. Victoria was still across the room. No one was looking at me. I set my glass down. Then I opened the purse. Inside were ordinary things. A phone lipstick, a neatly folded silk scarf, and enough empty space. I closed the bag again. Not yet. I needed the ring, and the ring was still in Betty's purse. At that moment, Betty was standing near the large eastern window talking with Margaret. They had known each other for years. Betty had a way of making people feel comfortable when they spoke with her. I walked over. Betty saw me and smiled. "Did you see our photo frame?" she asked. "I think we should place it near the gift table." I nodded. "Where's your purse?" I asked gently. Betty lifted the cream-colored bag slightly. "Right here." I reached out and took it. "Let me hold it for a moment," I said. "You should go greet the guests." Betty didn't question it. She always trusted me. She nodded, then turned back to continue speaking with Margaret. I held the purse in my hand. It felt light, but I knew there was something inside that didn't belong to Betty. I walked slowly toward the hallway beside the reception room, a quieter place where fewer people passed by. I opened the bag. The ring was there. The blue diamond reflected the light from the glass walls of the hallway. It shined with a cold brightness. $2 million, a number large enough to make many people lose their composure. But the thing that chilled me wasn't the price. It was the fact that this ring had just been used to turn my wife into a thief. I took the ring out. Then I looked down the hallway once more. No one was there. Inside my jacket pocket was a small item, an old photo frame. The family picture Betty had carried earlier that morning. I placed the frame into Betty's purse. It created a weight, almost like the ring. Not exactly the same, but close enough. Then I closed the bag. Everything happened in silence. I returned to the reception hall. The music was louder now. Most of the tables were filled. Servers were bringing out fresh trays of drinks. Victoria's purse was still on the table. I walked over, not rushing, not lingering. I opened the clasp and placed the ring inside. The sound of the diamond touching the fabric lining was soft, almost impossible to hear. I closed the purse. Then I picked up Betty's bag and set it on a chair near the wedding gift table, where she usually left her things. Everything looked completely normal. I walked back to the champagne bar and picked up another glass. From across the room, Victoria noticed me. She raised her glass in greeting. I lifted mine in return. We looked at each other for a few seconds. In her eyes, I could see the confidence of someone who believed everything had been perfectly arranged. Victoria had no idea the ring was no longer where she had placed it. A little later, Stephen stepped onto the small stage to begin the speeches. The guests grew quiet. I stood at the back of the room, holding my glass, watching my son. A part of me still hoped I had misunderstood what I heard that morning. But years in the courtroom had taught me something. The truth rarely changes just because we wish it would. I knew what would happen next. Soon, someone would announce that the ring was missing. And when that happened, this entire room would witness the performance Victoria had carefully prepared. There was only one small detail she didn't know. The ring was somewhere else now. Stephen stood on the small stage, set in the middle of the reception hall. Behind him was the tall glass wall looking straight out over the calm water of Lake Tahoe. The late afternoon sun had begun to touch the surface of the lake, casting a pale blue reflection across the ceiling. He held the microphone, adjusted the collar of his suit, and began saying the usual things about family and the future. I listened, but not very closely. I was waiting for something else, and it came sooner than I expected. About 10 minutes after Stephen finished his speech, a quiet murmur began near the guest dressing area. At first, only a few people turned their heads. Then Margaret's voice rang out, sharper than usual. "I'm certain I left it right here." The music stopped. People began to pay attention. Margaret walked quickly into the center of the room. Her face had gone pale, and in her hand she was still holding an empty velvet box. "My ring," she said. "It's not in the box anymore." Those words moved through the room like a ripple across water. Some guests exchanged glances. Others looked down at the tables, as if the ring might suddenly appear between the glasses. Victoria was the first to step forward. She gently placed a hand on Margaret's arm, her voice soft, almost comforting. "Maybe it's just a small misunderstanding," Victoria said. "Today has been a little busy for everyone." Margaret shook her head. "No," she said. "I was wearing it just before I went into the dressing room. Then I put it back in the box." Stephen stepped forward as well. He tried to stay calm, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "We'll find it," he said. "Maybe someone picked it up by mistake." Victoria slowly turned, letting her eyes move across the room. Her gaze paused on a few handbags resting on chairs. Then she said the line I had been expecting. "Perhaps we should check everything," she said gently, "just to be certain." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. No one wanted to argue with a suggestion that sounded so reasonable. A security guard stepped forward. He exchanged a few words with Stephen, then nodded. "We'll just do a quick check," he announced, "just to avoid any misunderstanding." At that moment, Victoria turned toward Betty. Betty was standing near the flower table, still holding a small handkerchief. She looked slightly confused by the sudden attention. Victoria walked over and lightly held her hand. "Don't worry, Mom," she said, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "We're checking everything, so no one misunderstands you." That sentence made several guests glance toward Betty. A brief look, but long enough. I stepped closer. Betty looked at me, her brow slightly furrowed. "What's happening?" she asked quietly. "They're looking for a ring," I said. Betty nodded as if that were nothing unusual. "Oh," she said softly, "I hope they find it." By then, Victoria had already asked security to check a few handbags nearby. Everything was done politely. Each bag was opened, quickly looked through, then returned to its owner. Nothing. Then Victoria turned to Betty. "We should check Mom's bag too," she said calmly. Betty looked down at the cream-colored purse resting on the chair. She hesitated for a moment, not out of fear, simply because she wasn't used to being asked such a thing. I picked up the purse and handed it to the security guard. "No problem," I said. He opened the clasp. The entire room seemed to grow quieter. Victoria stood very close. I could see the look in her eyes, confidence, almost certainty. The guard looked inside the purse. Then he reached in and pulled out the only item there, a small photo frame. Our old family picture. He turned it over in his hands, then placed it on the table. That's all he said. A few guests let out quiet sighs of relief. Betty gave a small, embarrassed smile. "I brought it because I thought Stephen might enjoy seeing it again," she said. Victoria stood still. For a very brief moment, I saw something change in her eyes. A flash of surprise. Quickly gone. But she recovered almost immediately. "Well, that's good," she said with a smile. "At least we've ruled out one possibility." Stephen nodded, trying to look composed. "We'll keep checking," he said. Victoria turned toward the security guard. "Perhaps you should check my bag as well," she said, "so everyone can see that no one is excluded." That remark made several guests nod approvingly. A very clever gesture. She picked up her purse from the table and handed it over. I stood a few steps away. I said nothing. The guard opened the clasp. He looked inside, and then paused. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then he reached in and pulled out a small object. The blue diamond caught the light in the room, sending a cold shimmer across the ceiling. Margaret's ring. It rested in his palm, unmistakable. The entire room fell silent. A heavy silence. The kind that comes when people suddenly realize the story in front of them is not the story they believed a few minutes earlier. Victoria stared at the ring, then at her purse. I don't understand," she said. Stephen stepped forward quickly. "Someone must have put it there," he said. But his words sounded weak, because by now, hundreds of eyes in that room were looking at Victoria in a very different way. For a few seconds after the ring appeared, no one spoke. The security guard still held it in his hand, as if he himself hadn't quite understood what had just happened. The lights in the reception hall reflected off the blue diamond, giving it a cold glow that made it impossible to ignore. Victoria stood frozen. The polite smile she had been wearing was gone. She stared at the ring, then at her purse, as if hoping some explanation might appear on its own. I've never seen it in my bag," Victoria said. Her voice was quieter now. Stephen stepped forward. "Someone must have put it there," he said quickly. "There are plenty of servers working here." A few people in the room began whispering. I had heard excuses like that many times inside a courtroom. When the truth appears too early, people often look for the nearest exit. But Victoria was still trying to keep her composure. She turned to Margaret. "I'm very sorry about this," Victoria said. "Perhaps someone accidentally picked up the wrong bag." Margaret didn't answer right away. She simply looked at her ring, then at Victoria, her gaze slower and heavier than before. The air in the room began to grow tense. I stepped forward, not because I intended to say much right away, only because I knew this story wasn't finished yet. "Perhaps we should understand what really happened," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in a silent room, it carried. Stephen turned toward me. "Dad, this doesn't have to become complicated," he said. "We've already found the ring." I looked at my son for a moment. During many years on the bench, I learned something simple. The truth often hides in the small details people prefer to ignore. "Yes," I said slowly. "The ring has been found." I turned toward Victoria. "But the more important question is how it got there." Victoria said nothing. She simply tightened her grip on her purse. Stephen let out a short breath. "What are you suggesting, Dad?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. At the front of the reception hall stood a large screen. It had been prepared earlier to show childhood photos of Stephen and Victoria during dinner. I turned to the event manager. "Excuse me," I said. "I need to use that screen for a moment." The manager looked surprised. "Right now, Mr. Harrison, I believe this is the right moment," I replied. A few guests exchanged curious glances. The tension in the room was almost something you could feel in the air. Stephen stepped closer to me. "What are you doing?" he whispered. I looked him straight in the eyes. "Just clarifying a detail," I said. Then I turned to the technician standing near the sound system. "Please play the footage from the preparation room camera," I said. He stared at me for a moment. "The camera in the preparation room," I nodded. "Yes." Several guests began murmuring. Victoria frowned. What camera? She asked. I looked calmly at her. The security camera, I said. I had them installed last week. In truth, it was part of the wedding gift security system. A small detail most people had never noticed. Stephen looked at me again, and this time his expression clearly changed. You never mentioned that. I didn't think I needed to announce every detail, I replied. The technician finally turned on the screen. The lights in the reception hall dimmed slightly as the video began. At first, it showed the preparation room from earlier that morning. The vanity table, several jewelry boxes, sunlight coming through the window. Some guests watched the screen with quiet curiosity. Then Victoria appeared in the frame. She walked into the room and glanced around, as if making sure no one was there. In the hall, I heard a few quiet breaths. On the screen, Victoria opened Margaret's velvet box. The blue diamond shined under the morning light. She lifted it, studying it for a moment. Then, she turned toward the cream-colored purse resting on the chair. Every movement was slow, clear, nothing hidden, nothing unclear. On the screen, Victoria opened the purse and dropped the ring inside. A wave of silence spread through the reception hall. Stephen appeared in the frame a few seconds later. He said something the microphone didn't quite capture, but his nod was visible to everyone. The video stopped. No one spoke. Victoria stood completely still. The color seemed to have drained from her face. Stephen looked at the screen, then at me. Dad! He didn't finish the sentence. I looked at my son. Then I slowly looked around the room, where hundreds of eyes were moving from the screen to Victoria. It appears the ring was placed in my wife's purse this morning, I said. My voice remained calm, but inside me, something had broken a long time ago. I looked at Victoria one more time, and I believe I said slowly, everyone here has just seen who did it. After the video stopped, the room was almost completely silent. No one spoke. No one rushed to move. Hundreds of guests stood beneath the soft lights of the wedding reception, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. Victoria remained standing in the middle of the room. Her purse had slipped onto the chair beside her, the clasp still open. Margaret's ring had already been returned to its owner, but no one was paying attention to the blue diamond anymore. Every eye was on Victoria. Stephen was the first to speak. Dad, it's not like that. His voice no longer carried the same confidence. I looked at my son. Perhaps for the first time in many years, I was looking at him like a stranger, not like what I asked. Stephen opened his mouth, then stopped. He looked at Victoria as if hoping she might say something that would explain everything. Victoria finally moved. She took a small step forward, her voice lower now. I only wanted to test whether the security system was working, she said. A few guests exchanged glances. That explanation was far too weak to stand in this room. I didn't argue with her. After many years inside courtrooms, I learned something simple. Sometimes, silence speaks more clearly than any accusation. I turned toward Margaret. I'm very sorry you had to witness this on a day meant for celebration, I said. Margaret studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. I believe today I've learned a few things about people, she said. The security staff quietly stepped back. No one needed them anymore. Everything was already clear. Stephen walked closer to me. You didn't have to do this in front of everyone, he said quietly. I looked at him. Do you think this started here? I asked. Stephen didn't answer. I turned toward Betty. All that time she had remained near the flower table, still holding the same small handkerchief. She looked around the room with mild confusion. Honey, she said softly when I approached. What were they watching? I gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Just a misunderstanding that's been cleared up, I told her. Betty nodded slowly. She didn't ask anything else. Maybe the most painful part of that day was knowing she had no idea how close she had come to walking straight into a trap. I turned back towards Stephen and Victoria. They were still standing in the center of the room, but now the distance between them and the other guests had become obvious. No one stepped closer. That quiet distance sometimes carries more weight than any criticism. I took a slow breath. Stephen, I said. He looked at me. You and Victoria should leave the reception. The room fell silent once again. Stephen frowned. Are you serious? I have never joked about things like this, I said. Victoria finally spoke. You can't do that on our wedding day. I looked at her. A wedding day is the beginning of something, I said, but it also reveals who people truly are. I paused for a moment. The Harrison family established a trust many years ago, I continued. Starting today, Stephen, you will no longer be involved in managing it. A wave of murmurs moved through the room. Stephen stared at me in disbelief. You can't just decide that. Yes, I said calmly. I can, and I have. There was no shouting, no dramatic argument, just the truth. Standing quietly in the middle of the room, as clear as the sunlight shining through the glass walls of the mansion, Stephen looked at me for a few more seconds. Then he turned away. Victoria followed him. The two of them walked past rows of guests who said nothing as they passed. The large doors of the mansion opened. A soft breeze from the lake drifted into the room as they left. After a while, the music started again, softer than before. Betty and I walked out into the garden behind the house. A narrow path led down the hillside toward the calm water of Lake Tahoe. The sun was almost touching the horizon. Betty held my hand. Today felt a little strange, she said. I smiled faintly. Maybe it did. We walked slowly along the stone path. Betty paused for a moment to look at the white flowers growing along the fence. She was still smiling, as if the whole day had simply been a long celebration. Watching her then, I realized something. Money can build grand houses, lavish weddings, and rings worth millions of dollars. But real peace isn't found in any of those things. It lives in very small moments, a familiar hand in yours, a quiet path, and the feeling that sooner or later, the truth always finds its way to the surface. I held Betty's hand a little tighter. The lake in front of us was perfectly still, and for the first time that entire day, I felt that everything had finally returned to where it belonged. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If this story made you reflect on family, on trust, and on how the truth always finds a way to surface, take a moment to give the video a like. And if you'd like to hear more real-life stories like this, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. You can also share this video with your friends or family. Who knows? They might find something meaningful in it too. Thank you again for listening all the way to the end.